Well, I'm sure you all know the presidential debate is happening tonight. We will all, no doubt, be tuning in as penance for our sins, as an act of self-harm, out of the kind of prurient interest that causes one to stare at a passing train wreck. But here on Young Heretics, we are having the only debate that really matters, and that is, which is better, the Iliad or the Odyssey? I really do mean that this is the only debate that matters. I know it can seem a little privileged or out of touch to say that this stuff is more important than politics. And that doesn't mean that politics isn't important. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't go out and vote. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't be paying attention to what's going on in the world and acting to the best of your ability in a virtuous way as God has given it to you to be able to do in the sphere where you have influence. All of that remains 110% true. But if you wait for that stuff to be resolved before you turn your attention to higher things, you will never get to higher things. That's the secret to the world, you guys. The secret to the life of the mind, the secret to the Western tradition. If you only turn your attention to first principles, to the grand tradition, to the big scope of history that you are a part of, if you only turn your attention to that once all the other stuff, all the practical stuff is out of the way, you'll never do it, because the world is always giving you more and more of a mess. The world is a dumpster fire, and every moment is a particularly new kind of dumpster fire that you just have to be attending to. And somewhere in the midst of it, whether it's for 30 minutes in the morning or for an hour in the afternoon when you would otherwise be watching Netflix, you have to find the space to reach for higher things. That's what people have been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years. It's how we've kept this tradition alive. You think Boethius didn't have politics to worry about? You think Homer wasn't trying to put food on the table? You think Thomas Aquinas never had to sort out some annoying bureaucratic issue at the universities he was a part of? No, of course they dealt with all this stuff. It was just as urgent, just as important, and just as annoying as it is now. The dangers are very real. The problems that this country faces are very real, and the way that they might affect us are real. So all of that means we should be paying attention, but it doesn't mean that we should panic and lose sight of the higher things and of the literature that can guide us ultimately in a more humane direction, because there are practical effects to reading great literature. I think we've seen a lot of the insight that even just one poem, the Iliad, can generate. And we're going to see more now as we turn to the second Homeric poem, the sequel, kind of, the Odyssey. But before we get to all of that, we have to love the thing in itself. That's the only way to know anything, is to love it for its own sake. And again, loving something for its own sake is not inherently in itself practical. The thing that you love is an end, not a means. And whatever you get out of that you can then apply to your life is very beautiful and important, but it's not the purpose of looking at the thing. We're here to read poetry, and ultimately getting there, getting to our highest cause, living the life of the mind and the soul and the heart, is why we're on this earth, and the reason that we fight through all the other messy politics to make that stuff possible. So here we are. I'm very glad to be with you doing this, talking about the Odyssey. We've been on a real journey, and I mean it when I say that I've been reading these poems for a long time, and I'm learning things with you as I talk through first the Iliad, now the Odyssey on Young Heretics. It's wonderful that I'm also teaching these poems at the same time. I have a class that I'm teaching at New College, Florida, and we've been starting our survey of Greek literature with the Iliad and the Odyssey. And between these two things, between translating some of the poem for you and talking with you about it and teaching it in college, I just am really seeing new stuff in the poems that I've never seen before. And I think that's going to be true for all of us, for all of our lives. And many times you read these poems, you see new things. It's part of why they're masterworks. And in some ways, with the Odyssey, we enter into very new territory. This is a very different kind of poem in a lot of ways, especially in stylistic ways. It's famously a much more twisty poem. The word that is applied to Odysseus at the very beginning of the poem is polutropos, which means something like many ways. And there are a bunch of different ways that you can translate this, but tropos is a way or a path, and polu means many. And so polutropos is a man of many ways and wiles and twists and turns. And that's how this story proceeds too. The Iliad has one narrator who tells you the story of one thing, the Manus, the rage, which we've now traced from its very beginnings in the confrontation between Achilles and Agamemnon, all the way up to something like its resolution in the grief that breaks out between Achilles and Priam. And that story, famously, Aristotle remarked upon this, is self-contained. There are flashbacks and there are time manipulations of a kind that we're familiar with from movies and novels ever since. But basically, you can tell the story in a sort of linear fashion. The Odyssey is constructed in a totally different way. It jumps around. It begins effectively at the end of its timeline. So we start when Odysseus is almost on the way to reaching home, and much of what we remember from the Odyssey is a flashback that Odysseus tells us in books 9 through 11, primarily. When he's talking to the Phaeacians, he relates all of his many adventures. And I said in the Iliad, when we were talking about the Iliad, I said there's lots of stuff that you think is in the Iliad that isn't in the Iliad. In other words, there are all these myths and stories that surround it that you can tell that help to understand and frame the poem, but aren't actually told in the poem or are even expressly rejected from the poem. They're not part of the Iliad. The Odyssey, it's almost the other way around. The part of the Odyssey that you know about or remember about, if you know anything about the Odyssey, is Circe and the Calypso, the Cyclops, Scylla and Charybdis, all these monsters and adventures and legends and all the sorts of stuff that isn't really in the Iliad. You remember that part, but that's actually a really small part of the Odyssey. It's folded into this larger narrative that goes back and forth and actually begins, as we'll discuss today, not with Odysseus, really, although we're told at the beginning that this is going to be Odysseus' story. But the first 4 books, which are sometimes called the Telemachy, are called that because they're the story of Telemachus, Odysseus' son. And it's really the invention of what would later be called the Bildungsroman, that is the novel or the story of a young man's coming of age. And in that, it offers, just in itself, as a little self-contained unit, this book is, or these 4 books are kind of a beautiful little picture of something that will be a major, major theme of world literature for all the rest of history, and indeed was already a theme of literature. The coming of age of a young hero, a young man, wasn't invented by Homer, but he does give it to us in a very profound and interesting form, and then folds it into this larger story of a man's homecoming. So in many, many ways, we're going to be dealing with a different kind of poem, and I'm genuinely curious, to know which of these 2 kinds of poem you prefer. Different eras throughout history have liked different versions of the Homeric poems. That is, some eras have really loved the Iliad more than the Odyssey, and some eras have really loved the Odyssey more than the Iliad. Generally speaking, the public opinion in different times has shifted. The Iliad has been a favorite in times when moral righteousness, martial valor, sort of standard and ordered civilized life has been a high priority, a high value, times of great civilizational confidence, when war is a major or at least an accepted part of life. And I'm thinking here of like the early modern period, especially the Iliad is thought of as the great work. And the Odyssey is kind of the comedic afterthought. And it definitely has more comedy in it. I've talked a lot about how the Iliad is kind of a tragic poem. The Odyssey is more comedic. There are more mishaps. There's more awkward stuff and deliberately, I think, funny things that happen. And it's more hairy and twisty and sort of haphazard, so it has maybe kind of a commedia buffa or like a sketch comedy vibe to it. And that has made it seem lesser to a lot of critics in different times. Later on, in like the 20th century, for example, when people were less confident about the brash going forth into war and the heroism, and feeling less enthused after the world wars about the experience of fighting, after industrial warfare had kind of reconfigured everybody's brain and left everybody traumatized, then you get this motion, this movement in literature toward more kind of subversive or weird or oblique ways of looking at things. And then the Odyssey becomes really interesting, because the Odyssey is full of unreliable narrators. There are moments when it's not even clear what the truth is underneath what different people tell you, which is feels like a very modern technique, but actually is quite ancient. The idea that Odysseus is telling you his story, but how do we know that he's telling you the truth? He's giving you his perspective, but then he's also layering on what he thought later after the moment. And then, of course, there's the narrator himself, who is much less in control than he was in the Iliad. So there are times in history, especially I'm thinking of like the postmodern period, when the Odyssey starts to feel way cooler. And there's a reason why James Joyce, the great modernist novelist of all time, his real masterpiece is Ulysses, which is just the Roman name for Odysseus, and it is a modern retelling of this poem, of the Odyssey poem. Not only is that because of the style, because of the way that the poem twists and turns, and the way that it gives you all these different perspectives and subverts itself, and even in some instances subverts the values of the Iliad. There's going to be a moment down the line, we won't talk about this today, but there's a moment down the line where Achilles himself appears and basically calls into question everything that I've just been saying over these many weeks about how Achilles fought for his kleos, his glory, and that was his fitting recompense for an early death in war. All of that is going to be kind of upended or questioned, and we have to shift our focus now to a new way of looking at things, because the war is over and we're heading home. So that was a thing of great fascination for a post-war era, for the second half of the 1900s, certainly. But also, this was a time, that second half of the 20th century was a time of real concern, questioning, and uncertainty about the concept of identity. What is it? Who am I, and who am I supposed to be? If we can't fit anymore into these heroic, glorious archetypes, how can we live good lives in this modern world that doesn't provide us as many opportunities for heroism? All of those questions are there already in the Odyssey. And I don't think that they destroy the valorous ideals of the Iliad, but they do acknowledge and allow us to kind of question and explore the fact that even if there are moments when it seems like heroes can rise above their mortality and fight with the gods and all of that, at the end, you still have to pick up the pieces. At the end, we're still in this messy world where Kamala Harris is running against Donald Trump for the president of the United States, and we have to figure out how to navigate the least bad option amid that ruinous dumpster fire. That's part of this poem too. And so in another sense, in one way it's very different from the Iliad, but in another way we're picking up here right where we left off. And this is one reason among many why I think we are dealing with one author, with Homer, not just with various different singers who stitched things together, but with an individual with an artistic vision who has completed one story, the story of rage in war, and now picks back up with a new story, the story of a man coming home from war. But in some sense, it's the perfect next story to tell, even though you might be surprised that we leave out the whole end of the war. The Trojan horse is not in the Iliad, the famous episode in which the Greeks hide inside a giant wooden horse and pretend to give it to the Trojans as a gift of surrender, but instead they massacre everybody, and it's during this final battle that Achilles is killed, and in the legend he's killed by Paris with an arrow to the heel that is supposedly vulnerable, although not in the Iliad. All of that is not told. There are other poems where that appears, which we may get into down the road. For example, the Aeneid begins its narrative with the fall of Troy, and we do get that in flashback. It doesn't start there in book one, but we eventually are told that that's kind of how Aeneas' journey begins, and we get a very vivid picture of the fall of Troy. Homer doesn't really tell us about that. He skips right over it because he has a thread to pick up, and that is the thread of reintegration into society, of the warrior after war. Last week I talked about how that's what the end of the Iliad is about, that the rage of Achilles has its reasons, it has its motivations, it even, you might say, has its justifications. It also, in the heat of battle, far exceeds the limits of Achilles' humanity and turns him into something beast-like, which, as I said last week, is something that soldiers know about, that we place soldiers in this position where they have to, for all of our benefit, go and exert force and tap into a kind of animal-like rage. But that's a burden that we place on them, and no question. That's part of the price they pay on all of our behalfs as warriors, is that they unleash something in the human psyche that is not altogether tameable or controllable, and can, if you're not very, very careful, can run away with your soul. And it's in the encounter with Priam that we see what the way out of this is, that they let go of their mutual animosity and share this universal human moment of grief. And so the poem ends basically by saying grief is the answer to war when all is said and done, that the rage which fuels war must finally burn out into sorrow at the tragic nature of our situation. And this is how the Iliad kind of gives you all the threads that now the Odyssey is going to have to tie together, because Achilles doesn't have to go home. He knows that from the beginning. He knows that at whatever other terrible costs he may pay, those costs will be paid in full by the end, because he is going to die. And that death is not, that doesn't make the death good or happy, but it does mean that he doesn't have to deal with the other problem, the soldier's other problem, which is coming home. And that's what Odysseus has to deal with. And that's what this poem is about. It's about how after war, after grief, after all the shouting is done and the dust has settled, how do we return to being human, to living domestic, peaceable life, to managing a household? And the journey that Odysseus takes, of course, is a rip-roaring adventure and does have all of these monsters and battles and stuff in it, but it also, from the very beginning, is about who Odysseus is going to be and how he's going to become the man that can rule over Ithaca, his homeland, again. Ithaca, by the way, is an island to the northwest of the Greek mainland, so it's in the Ionian Sea, and Odysseus takes an extremely circuitous route all the way to the west toward Italy and around and about, and we're going to get into his adventures and his wanderings as we talk through this poem. But Odysseus is really making a journey, a twofold journey, and this is one of the oldest takes on the poem, so I'm not telling you anything exactly new here. But we tend to think this as a very modern interpretation, maybe, of the poem. And yes, this was very interesting to people like James Joyce and to later scholars and writers in the 1900s, but in the poem, it's not really there expressly. I think, and I'm going to suggest to you, that actually the poem is really playing with this from the very beginning. It's playing with it in a subtle way. It's not coming out and delivering a speech or a treatise about the ideas, but it does contain all of these ideas from the beginning. And that starts from the very first word, which, unlike the Iliad, which begins with Manus, the Odyssey begins with aner, meaning man, meaning what does it mean to be a man? That's the subject of the poem. Andra moi enne pemusa polutropon. Sing to me, muse, of the man of many ways or wiles or turns. Hos malapolla planktheepe troies hieron teliethron epersen. So after he had sacked the citadel of Troy. So here's my own translation of the Odyssey. I'm going to keep doing what I've been doing, which is translate these passages for you myself, not because I think I'm the greatest translator out there, but because I think new translations have a value of their own, and that these can sound fresh and help us to hear and help me to get a handle on the text as well. Here we go. Tell me, muse, about a man of many ways and wanderings after he sacked the citadel of Troy, the many towns he saw, and how he came to know the minds of all the many men that lived there, how his heart was wounded many a time at sea, straining to gain his life back and bring his comrades home. So he tells you right up front. I mean, he doesn't play any of his cards all that close to the breast. Everything about the poem is in here. the ways and minds of many men. That's going to be part of this journey, is Odysseus is going to encounter all sorts of different nomoi, all different customs, ways of doing things, ways of life. He's going to ask himself and be forced to ask whether anything is universal to all humanity, whether there are any natural laws or moral laws that are true everywhere, and whether there are different ways of life that are better than others, and some worse than others. And this is also about Greekness, or at least the first stirrings of the idea that this is a Greek man trying to become Greek, or trying to become native to his own land. Remember that he is now 20 years older than when he left. So he left for the war. The war was 10 years. He wanders for 10 years and comes back home. So when he starts off, he's a young, very young, vigorous man. When he comes back, he needs to be the father of a family, including a 20-year-old boy. His son, Telemachus, was an infant when he left, so he's just hitting 20 now, and we're going to see his coming of age, which is actually a perfect introduction to what this poem is about, because it shows us what's at stake in Odysseus' responsibilities. Not just that he has to get home to clear up the situation that's going on, but that this boy needs a father, and Odysseus needs to be the man who can be that father. He's not yet. He's a very skilled warrior. He's very crafty and cunning. He's able to use his intellectual firepower to do all sorts of fun things. But of course, what he needs is not so much cunning as wisdom. And there's a reason why the goddess who presides over this poem and over this journey is Athena, goddess of wisdom. She is a trickster goddess. She has tricks up her sleeve. She often will disguise herself, but she also is shaping the man and his son and his family into a new coherent unit. The gods, I would say, it's interesting because in the Iliad, I often commented on how the gods seem aloof, and that remains true here. But also, from the beginning, the gods are really concerned to do right by the humans, which is not so much true in war. In war, we're forced to confront the possibility that the universe might have bigger fish to fry than us humans. In this more homely story, the very beginning, really, after we hear that opening, is a discussion among the gods about Odysseus being hard done by. So Zeus starts out, and he tells the story, which will be a counterpoint for Odysseus' story for the whole poem, and that is the story of Agamemnon's return home. And we will get this later on in Aeschylus' tragedy, and this is a story that will be repurposed and reused throughout Greek literature. But here, Zeus tells it just briefly, mentions that Agamemnon has come home and been killed by Aegisthus, who is, in Aeschylus' play, Aegisthus is the rival lover of Clytemnestra, Agamemnon's wife, and it's really Clytemnestra who's the leader of the plot. In the Odyssey, this is more about some kind of territorial rivalry between these two kings, Aegisthus and Agamemnon. But Zeus tells this story and tells about the fate of Aegisthus thereafter as basically something that Aegisthus brought on himself. He is to blame for his own suffering, and says, these men, they blame us. They tell us that we are to blame. I mean, he's almost commenting or riffing on the Iliad. They act as if we have killed them or we've razed their cities, but really they bring it on themselves. It's Athena who says, but wait, how can you say that when Odysseus has always honored the gods, and now he is beaten back by Poseidon, and Poseidon is the main rival here, from reaching his homeland. He's been terribly, terribly bedraggled and kept from the one thing he wants, which is home and his faithful, beloved wife, Penelope. And an interesting feature of the poem is that this is the first place where we hear Odysseus' name. So we've had aner, andra moi enipemusa, which means just sing to me a man. But one of the driving questions, and this is very intentional, who is this man? Who does he want to be? Who is he now, and who is he becoming? So it's fitting that we only get his name now, and from the jump, we get it alongside a pun. And puns are everywhere in this poem, especially to do with Odysseus' name. There's a bunch of words that sound like Odysseus' name. One of the major plot points in the Cyclops episode is that the word nobody, oudes, sounds a little bit like Odysseus. Here, we have Athena's question, ti nu hoi tosson Odysseus, deo. And this is the Greek verb odysomai, which means to be enraged at. So why are you so angry at him, Zeus? Athena says. But that, of course, Odysseus sounds almost exactly like Odysseus. So we get right off the bat this delayed revelation that this is the man's name. This is his identity from the war. We've known him in previous stories. And yet there's something malleable that his name fits into all these different sentences, and it sounds like all these other words, and it even sounds like nobody. So in this very modern way, or it seems modern to us, the poem is introducing the question off the bat, who is this guy going to be? And the first answer I would suggest that it proposes to us is this guy is going to have to be a father and a husband and a leader of a household. And this is what I'm really curious to see when the movie comes out. Remember, we're doing this whole thing because there's a movie coming out of Odysseus about Odysseus' return in December. And when that movie comes out, I'm really curious to see how they handle this element, because it's about the final books of the Odyssey and about what happens when Odysseus finally gets home. But we are told kind of off the bat, because Athena goes straight to visit Telemachus and to buck him up, essentially. Telemachus has been at home, never known his father, but Athena knows now that there's going to be a meeting between them because finally Odysseus is going to be allowed to return home, and she's preparing Telemachus to sally forth and be ready to receive his father and to go and look and to sort of inspire his own manhood. And she comes in the person of Mentor, which is where we get that word mentor. It used to just be the name of the guy that Athena pretends to be. Now it means anybody who mentors you, who raises you up from immaturity into maturity. And that's where we get this idea of the goddess of wisdom leading the young man to take his place at the head of the household, to work his way to maturity, even though he hasn't had a father, which this is a part of the poem that doesn't get talked about perhaps quite enough, but it's a part that is extremely relevant for our times when fatherlessness, talk about something that doesn't get talked about enough. We have this huge fatherlessness epidemic in the modern West, in America especially. And it's the sort of thing that if we didn't think of ourselves as so modern and civilized, we would consider this barbaric, that there are so many children, especially boys, raised without fathers. And we've got this really brain dead and stupid narrative that we get from the sexual revolution and from the political efforts that the second wave feminists made to try to get women out of the house and into the workforce and all of that. And just to be clear, I'm sort of a squish about women going to work. I'm not saying this because I think it's bad that women have more options now and can have careers that go alongside being a mother or have just a range of possibilities. I think, for one thing, it was inevitable after the Industrial Revolution that was going to happen. This is not the sort of thing you could have prevented. But also, I think that it's part of our trajectory toward greater freedom, greater human actualization. I'm enough of an optimist about history to think that over time, we are actually evolving as a species. And so I would say, yeah, great that we let women into the workforce, or indeed that we were forced to have women in the workforce because of the wars and the Industrial Revolution and all of that. But like everything human, it came along with a whole bunch of nonsense. And part of the nonsense was this idea that women up to that point had been dreadfully oppressed and kept as chattel because it was the mean, nasty men that just wanted them at home. But actually, it was an arrangement that had worked for hundreds of years before these technological advances changed the state of the game. It wasn't the case that pre-industrial women never did any work. It was just that there was a huge, what was called the cottage industry, the work at home. And the Industrial Revolution kind of destroyed that by creating these factories that did a lot of the stuff like the weaving and the sewing and whatever that enabled women to go out into the workforce, because all the stuff that they were previously working on at home, if you read like Proverbs, the book of Proverbs has a depiction of the good woman, and she's buying fields, she's making food, she's doing business deals, waking up early in the morning to negotiate. All of this to say, this idea that women were inherently structurally abused before they left the home has created a really silly picture of what the world looked like before that happened. And in Betty Friedan's seminal text about this, The Feminine Mystique, she compares the home of the early 20th century housewife to a comfortable concentration camp, which is just preposterous, because really what we have here is a division of labor and an arrangement that had been going on from time immemorial, and some dimensions of that remain in place even as technology has changed the landscape of our world. And one of the dimensions of that is the necessary role of the mother and the father, and especially the role of the father in the son's life. So even though Penelope, Telemachus' mother, is a good woman and portrayed as a good woman, we have this narrative now that, oh yeah, it's fine. A woman can do anything a man can do, including be a single mom or get divorced and not have the kids have any problems, and the kids will be all right, and divorce is fine too. And we developed this new story that there were no costs to breaking up the nuclear family. And this is part of the nonsense, because of course there's a terrible cost to growing up without a father, without your parents together in the home. This is an awful, awful loss. And Telemachus, unlike us, Homer isn't really married to any of these silly things that we came up with in the 60s and 70s about, oh yeah, there's no problem to not have a dad. Homer knows that this is a terrible problem, and that Telemachus has to fight his way through it somehow, because Odysseus hasn't come home for a long time, and so far as Telemachus knows, isn't coming home, even though he's right on the cusp, unbeknownst to him, of finally meeting his father. But he can't wait for that in order to become a man, and he has to find some route to manhood, and that route has to come essentially from on high. He needs a male role model, but he needs also divine luck and providence and care. And I think that's, if you talk to guys that grew up without fathers, that's true. They'll say things like God or Providence sent me into the path of somebody that could teach me, whether it was a coach or a teacher or a friend's dad or whatever. And this is something that young men and older mentors have to do when there's fatherlessness around. And that's a picture of what happens here, although with this mythological overlay of Athena and so on and so forth. And the moment when we know that this has really taken place is a moment that might shock our modern sensibilities for all the reasons that I've just been talking about. That now we have this notion that just because women have become newly liberated, therefore women and men are exactly the same, and it's evil and wrong to assign different roles to men and women, or to suggest that men and women might prefer different roles. Here, there's a very clear, in fact, we might even say perhaps overly clear in the opposite direction, idea about men's roles and women's roles. So all the stuff that I've just said about how feminism is silly, really, and especially second wave feminism was really overdrawn and to use a charged word, kind of hysterical about the situation of women before the workforce. That doesn't mean that there weren't problems with the old arrangement too. Everything involves trade-offs, and I don't think that modern women would really be happy in Penelope's position, or that Penelope would be happy in a modern woman's position. But there's certainly excesses in the old way too, and I think that the poem is honest about that in this scene as well. So let me just set the scene here for a bit. Okay, so in Odysseus' absence, while Odysseus is away, what has happened is that a bunch of suitors, that is, opportunistic men from all around, have come to try and win the hand of Penelope, Odysseus' wife. And they figure this was the king of Ithaca. Remember that at this stage, Greece is divided into city-states, small locales or islands, ruled over by one warlord or king, and Odysseus was one of the kings, one of the leaders. And so now that throne is vacant, and this very wealthy household with a wife and son is standing open. And as I discussed when we were talking about ancient Israel and some of the laws and ideas in ancient Israel, part of the pre-industrial economic arrangement was that men, having the physical strength and initiative to perform sort of the economic labor as described like back in the book of Genesis, are in charge of an economic unit called a household. And we don't always think of the household as an economic unit, except, of course, that the word economy comes from the Greek word oikia, which is household. And so the oikos, the house, is the basic building block, as Aristotle says in the Politics, of the political arrangement and the economic arrangement. So the man leads it, the pater familias, the father, and then within his care, not just within his control, but also within his care, he has all the children and any wives he may take, singular or plural. And it's of truth universally acknowledged, as Jane Austen might say, that a household in want of a father figure must be looking for one, must have an opening, a job opening for somebody to come and take control. Now, that would, in some contexts, actually be a virtuous impulse. In fact, as we know from the Bible, in some situations, it's sort of your responsibility if a woman is left widowed or abandoned or alone without somebody to manage the household and bring in new wealth and take care of things, then it would be your responsibility to take care of your brother's wife if your brother died or whatever. And so there are some versions of what the suitors are doing that actually look good. In this case, unfortunately, there's a lot of wealth and power at stake, and importantly, there's the will of the woman herself, which is not formally recognized by the system in any powerful way, but which is very much the motivating or driving force behind Penelope not getting married, because Penelope famously, faithfully, beautifully is waiting for Odysseus. She believes Odysseus will come back, hope against hope, even though they've had no news, even though he's been gone for years and years. She's determined. And so she has basically put the suitors off because there's a certain degree of pressure on her to restore the household and to find a king and basically anoint somebody. She's got all this power to disperse, and that power needs to rest with somebody. And so there's pressure on her to make a choice, but she won't do it. She doesn't want to do it. And so she's weaving a death shroud. And the death shroud is this beautiful work of art. It's an important part of the burial ritual. And famously, mythically, she unweaves it every night. She undoes the work that she has done the previous day. And so she keeps saying, when I finish this death shroud, I'm going to marry somebody. Let me mourn, grieve my father first, and then when I finish the death shroud, then I'll pick a suitor. But she's delaying and delaying and delaying by secretly unweaving the death shroud. And this is the household, the dysfunctional situation in which Telemachus has been raised. It's no fault of Penelope's, but it is a terrible scenario, and it's no way for this young man to grow up. And it's into that scenario that Athena comes to Telemachus and effectively says, these are not the words that she uses, but I'm sort of describing this scene now. The scenario is Telemachus needs somebody to tell him, yes, you have been handed a really bad hand. Everything is in disarray and a shambles. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to wait for that problem to be fixed, or are you going to step into man's estate and make the best of this terrible situation? And this is something that I have recently been thinking about a lot, actually, that when we go through periods where it just seems like nothing's going right and nothing is working, we can be tempted to just throw up our hands and say, well, since nothing is going right, I don't have the energy, I don't have the wherewithal, I can't really, I'm so sad and unhappy that I'm just going to let all my discipline go and I'm just going to give into the suck of it all. And of course, the reason that is a foolish and perhaps even a satanic kind of temptation is that that's going to only make things worse. The fact that things are going badly, the fact that maybe you have screwed up or you've lost some of your motivation and some of your discipline doesn't change what the right things in life to do are. The things that make things better remain the same always. And this is one reason why religious people always say God is good all of the time. The good in itself is always good. Just because you don't want to do it, just because you don't feel like doing it, just because you've failed to do it, doesn't mean that it stops being the right thing to do. And so you can actually just always lean on wherever you are. I'm at least not going to make things worse. I'm at least going to move toward the ideal, even in the world that is totally hostile to that ideal. And I think that's what Telemachus has to learn through sheer grit and through the help of heaven to do here. And there's a moment where he takes the reins from his mother. And what I love about it, speaking of the problems or the difficulties of living in a... Speaking of the fact that no arrangement is really perfect, I think Homer shows us here that Telemachus doesn't do this perfectly. And this is another thing that mothers and sons, speaking now not just of fathers and sons, but mothers and sons, have to grapple with, is that for most of your life as a young man, you're probably raised by your mother, and your mother loves you more than anybody in the world if she's a good mother. And you love her probably in a way that you will never love anybody else. And yet, part of your task as a young man is to break away and to become yourself and to develop higher and higher degrees of autonomy. And there's no version of that that isn't painful. There is a hypothetical version of that that goes perfectly, that is done with grace on both sides, where the son says, "Mother, I must now come to man's estate." And the mother says, "Son, go forth to man's estate, and I no longer have control over you. You are your own man." But we're not those people. We're not that world. We're the fallen world. We have all these terrible problems, and we do things wrong, and we make mistakes, and we're always living our life for the first time. So we're never experts at whatever it is we're up to. And this is what happens between Telemachus and Penelope. He doesn't really take the reins in a measured or controlled sort of way. He takes it in a very teenager coming of age sort of way. He's surly. He's, I think, overly aggressive. And this is something that boys do. They lash out at their moms. I mean, teenage girls lash out in their own ways when they're finding their independence. But boys tend to be surly, aggressive, moody, and to overstate their authority because they're not sure of it yet. Confident men, wise, developed older men, never exert more authority than they need to exert because they don't have anything to prove. They know that they're in control of themselves, that they're in control of whoever is under their responsibility, under their care. So a mature man, unlike the feminist caricature of the immature, boorish man, a truly mature and manly man doesn't need to overstate his authority. He simply wields it. A boy that is learning to become a man will often be a total jerk about it because he's not sure of himself. So that's a function of lack of confidence. That's a function of insecurity when boys do this. And that's what Telemachus does. It would be better if he did it a different way, I think, than he does in this passage that I'm about to read. But he's got to do it, and he's late in doing it. And so he does it in this extremely forceful way. And let's just read and see what happens. Because what's going on here is that the singer Phemius is in the halls, and he's singing a song of the difficulties of the Greeks coming back home. So this is going to be a theme of the Odyssey, that the singer will often sing the story of what's going on in the moment. And so there's this real meta self-awareness. This is the song we're singing. It's also something that the characters are aware of as a matter for poetic lamentation. And it's too much for Penelope, who's suffering the awful grief. She hasn't gotten closure on her husband's departure in war, and so she tells Phemius to stop. She censures him, and by default, she's in control of the household. But it's in this moment that Telemachus takes control, and he says, "Leave this singer alone." Here's what he says, again in my translation. "Mother of mine, why resent this singer, tried and true, for singing whatever comes to his mind? Singers are not the source of the things they sing. It's Zeus, after all, who gives to men that work for their bread whatever he chooses for each. This man deserves no blame for the evil fate he sings, the fate of the Greeks. When it comes to songs, people holler and cheer for the latest thing, whatever they happen to hear that's new. And as for you, steel your heart and your mind to brave the sound. Odysseus wasn't alone in losing his day of return at Troy. There were plenty of other men, too, who fell on those shores. Anyway, go in the house and take care of your own affairs, the loom and the distaff, and give your commands to the household girls to oversee their work. The business of speech is for men, on the whole, and for me most of all. The power in this house is mine. Now, this is a teenage boy or a young man on the cusp of manhood if I have ever seen one. This is a young pup finding his authority, and he does it with all the bluster and all the faux wisdom that we recognize from young men when they start to take their authority. All this philosophizing. Odysseus wasn't alone in losing his day of return. I don't know about you, but I don't believe that for a second. Telemachus is eaten up inside, but he's learning to take control of his emotions, and he's doing it with this kind of grandiloquent philosophy. When it comes to songs, people holler and cheer for the latest thing. These things are true, by the way. He's saying truisms that you could take out of context and use as a quote. People always love the latest songs. This is a very witty observation on Homer's part, of course, because he's a singer, so Homer knows that this is true. The audience always wants some novelty. Neo tate, the newest thing. But also Telemachus is saying this not from his vast store of wisdom and experience, but from ways that he's heard other men talk, philosophize, and mythos is what he says is men's business. He says the business of men is mythos, for me most of all, because mine is the authority in the house. So you go take care of your sphere of authority, and people miss this part, but he tells her, you have a role to play too, and it's in controlling the domestic economy, the loom and the distaff, which to us now sounds like this terrible subordination, but in fact is a real thing, that now they've got a proper division of labor in the house, that Telemachus is going to take care of these suitors because they're men, and he's going to engage with them in mythos, in speech, debate, deliberation, and perhaps, unfortunately, in physical conflicts. That's his role in the world. Hers is the loom and the distaff. And there is a famous and beautiful fact about this, that Penelope is waiting at the loom, which is the histon. And in Greek, that just means anything standing upright. So Greek looms would stand upright and the threads would hang down. I actually looked this up because I was like, I realize I have no idea how sewing and spinning works. Maybe this is my own gender blindness or something. But the distaff is the thing that basically spins out the wool. So you start with wool and then you have to make it into thread, and the distaff has this weight at the end that kind of spins out the wool. But the loom is where you weave the wool into cloth. And so he's saying, you have a job to do. I'm going to take care of my job now. And he's saying it too gruffly and in a moody way and in a very insecure sort of way. But he's saying it, and that's actually a good thing for the household, because he's the man of the house now, and he's got to take that role, and she's taking the histon, which is the parallel to Odysseus, who is also at a histon, something that stands upright, and that is his mast. The mast of his ship is also something that stands upright, just like her loom, and so they're in this parallel world, just as Penelope and Telemachus are in parallel spheres of their household. Penelope and her lost husband at the prow, at the mast of his ship, is standing at the same histon, the same upright thing that Penelope is also standing at her loom. So there's a parallel there, and then there's also a balance now that's being asserted in the household. And here's what happens in the immediate aftermath. Here's Penelope's reaction. He men thambe sasa palin, oikonde bebeke. She was totally stunned. Thambe sasa. And sometimes this is translated as struck dumb, or she doesn't respond. And sometimes, again, this could be interpreted as, now she's a woman, she's not going to do speech, she's going to go and be quiet. But I think she actually genuinely doesn't know what to say. It's probably a very painful moment for her that her son has asserted this authority in kind of a gruff way, as sometimes sons do. And mothers, I think good mothers, know in that moment that the pain they're feeling is wholesome pain in some way. It would be better if Telemachus had been more tender about it. But for her, she's an older woman. She's wise. She knows to keep her peace. She's shocked at, who is this new man in my house that I raised this boy? And of course there's grief in that. Of course there's letting go and loss. But there's also pride, and there's a certain degree of alarm in this new unruly man that has taken her household over all of a sudden. So I actually think thambe sasa is a perfect word there. Totally stunned, and she went back into the house, and she's going to reflect on these things. And yeah, she's been, quote unquote, put in her place. But it's so much more complex than I think our reductive and moralizing and arrogant modern interpretation would want it to be. This is a really human and tender moment that has many elements that we still recognize, and many elements that are foreign to us in the post-industrial, post-feminism world. And we have to reckon with both in order to really understand that what we are getting here is a picture of what happens when a fatherless boy, against all the odds, makes the decision, imperfectly, stumblingly, haltingly, to become a man. And with the help of heaven, that's going to be the first step toward meeting his father as he comes back home, which is what we will start to talk about next week as we move on through this poem and on through Telemachus' journey. Just a little preview, what's going to happen next is Telemachus is going to go looking for his father, and he's going to end up with none other than Menelaus, one of the former heroes of the Iliad, now the husband of Helen, back in Lacedaemon or Sparta, and that is where he will get news, our first news of Odysseus, and we will move on toward that part of the story next time. But for now, let us take a mailbag. So mailbag questions come to me through Substack, which is a newsletter where I write an essay every week, and it's a way for us to connect in all sorts of ways. I would love if you join me over there. It's rejoiceevermore.substack.com. And free and paid subscribers both can DM me or write in response to the emails that I send, however you want to do it. But that's the best way to get a question through to me. That's what I check most often. And I've really been enjoying all of your questions. Please keep them coming, even though I can't answer them all, but I will do my best to work through them as time goes on. This is a question from Jess. And Jess is somebody that is actually in the acknowledgments of my new book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, which is a book about the history of science and the future of faith. It's a story that I'm really excited for you guys to read. I think it's an important book, I have to say, in this moment when science is, many people will claim on behalf of science that it has disproved God, but in fact, there's wonderful religious insight coming from the scientific world, and there's a necessity, a need for science and faith to come together and to speak in dialogue. So that's what my book is about. And Jess, because she's a science teacher herself, read the book and was very, very kind in giving me notes and working through it. So I'm so grateful to Jess for that. And she's got a question that's related to this, and I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit about that since the book is coming up. It's coming out in October. There's been a slight backup at the printer, so I think we're looking at October 15th. But I'll drop the link to pre-order in the show notes, and we're not terribly far. We're about a month out, basically, from that. So here's Jess. The question for your Young Heretics mailbag is inspired by your exciting new opportunity to teach. As I mentioned, I'm teaching at New College, as well as the profound excellence of your upcoming book. That's very kind. Thank you, Jess. The question, being not asked in the name of self-interest at all, I hope you find enjoyable to consider. If you could teach a class, perhaps let's say a high school level class, at a Christian school, about the intersection of science and faith, say a survey of science history, what would be your reading for the course? I look forward to hearing your thoughts. And Jess says, besides your own new book, of course. So I am going to recommend my book as one, I think, good book that high schoolers could enjoy. It's written in an accessible way about the history of science and its religious motivations and the way that it seems now to be pointing back to a theistic interpretation of the world. So that's the first thing. I'll drop the link here, but I'll link to all of these books that I'm about to list now in the show notes. I think this is a really important topic, and if I didn't think that, I wouldn't have written this book. For a long time, we've had kind of a fashionable public opinion that science and religion are in some way inherently against each other. And there was a brief period when that might have made sense to believe, when it seemed like science was explaining so many things that religion used to explain, that people could feasibly say, yes, religion is fading away. John Lennon once said, I think it's going to wither and shrink and fade away, and then we'll enter into this bright age and dawn of reason. That has really not gone well. That has really not panned out, both intellectually and politically. It's become clear that the age of unreligion, the age of irreligion, is also the age of unreason. That as people lose sight of their faith, lose sight of the transcendent, lose a connection to the divine, they don't become more rational and kind and virtuous. They actually become more tribal, more primitive in their religious observance, more addicted to chanting and marching, and politics becomes a form of religion. And so it's really important, I think, at this moment for us to take stock of where science and religion actually stand, because we have this outdated, old way of thinking about this, as if science and religion were at war, as if science had disproven God, as if only smart people are all atheists or whatever. None of that is true, and we really do need a hard reset, because this is an obstacle. This idea is an obstacle to otherwise intelligent people becoming religious or entertaining religious ideas, as they think that in order to become religious, they have to let go of their reason, they have to let go of science and become superstitious kooks. So, as I write about in my book, that is not only not true, it's actually wildly outdated. The history of science is a history of faith. There is a brief period in science where science becomes antithetical, or scientists become antithetical to religious explanations. But we're actually now moving out of that period to a time when it's impossible to account for science and what it's discovering about consciousness without some sort of metaphysical idea or theory. So that's what my book is about. And the first book I would suggest on the list for this class, if you wanted to do a survey course on this topic, would absolutely be Stephen Meyer's The Return of the God Hypothesis. Stephen wrote the preface to my book. He's somebody I admire enormously. And this, right now, is the definitive book about this whole story. And I think it will remain the definitive book about this story of how religion and faith came at odds, how religion is now becoming more and more viable in scientific circles. It's called The Return of the God Hypothesis because Pierre-Simon Laplace, the great French physicist, once said that he had no need of God in his as a hypothesis in his mathematics and his science. Now Stephen is saying the God hypothesis is looking increasingly necessary to account for many of the phenomena we see. It's a very sophisticated, very, very readable book that I think high schoolers could totally enjoy, especially with good instruction from somebody like Jess. So I would start them with that because it's a survey. It gives you a really clear picture. And here's a little grad school trick that if you haven't discovered this may be useful. When you are trying to learn about a subject and get an introduction to a subject that you don't know about, start with a contrarian take. That is, start with somebody who is arguing against the prevailing opinion. The reason for that is that if the person that is making this contrarian argument is any good at all and is worth his salt, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to survey and even steelman, give you the strongest version of the prevailing opinion. And so he will give you in the footnotes, if you check and chase down the bibliography and the works he cites, he'll give you a really good survey of what those prevailing opinions are. And if you want to get a handle on them, you can then go away and read those books. Now, you shouldn't accept the contrarian's view of the prevailing opinion because he's going to be arguing against it. So he's going to be making his case for you. But contrarian books are actually fabulous resources for getting a handle on the mainline opinion as well. So you get both in one, essentially. And in Steve's case, he's making a very reasonable, not polemical at all, argument that also includes a survey of the history of people talking about, quote unquote, the wars of science and religion. So he gives you all that material and gives you, I think, a really reasonable summary of it, while also providing a really cogent argument for why this is no longer a reasonable way to understand science and faith as at war with each other. And that's a tip that you can take with you to the bank in any other context too. When I was in grad school, if I wanted to know about, say, the history of theater, I would read an essay that began by saying, the whole history of theater as it's commonly told is wrong. And the reason is the next paragraph would be, here's the whole history of theater as it's commonly told. And here are all the books where it's sold. And you're like, oh, great, I'll go away and read those books. And then I'll have this counter opinion. Very, very efficient way to do research. So Return of the God Hypothesis for all those reasons and because it is the authoritative book. Next, I would recommend Owen Barfield's Worlds Apart. And this is not a work of science, but a work of philosophy of science. And it's by, I think, one of the most sophisticated thinkers about that whole idea. And I would pair it actually with C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. Lewis, of course, a beautiful writer, and Barfield was not the writer that Lewis was, but between the two of them, they really had something to say. You might even include C.S. Lewis's Miracles in there too, which has a lot of Barfield kind of crib notes in it. Those, I think, were the most penetrating philosophers to see where the materialist science was going and to observe the problems with it. And I suggest Worlds Apart because you might think that you would begin with Saving the Appearances, which is Barfield's really central book about this whole issue. But Saving the Appearances is quite difficult. So I'm putting that in as extra credit. If you have Barfield Worlds Apart, Lewis's Miracles, and Lewis's Abolition of Man, then as a footnote for extra credit, maybe Saving the Appearances. Now, I think any good curriculum needs a countervailing view, a dissenting view. And since this is a curriculum that's going to be about the positive history of science and faith, I think you should read at least one book that strongly makes the case that God has, in fact, totally been exiled from science and should never be brought in and has been disproven by science. And so I'm going to recommend to you Victor Stenger's God, the Failed Hypothesis. I found Stenger very useful as I researched my own book because he comes right out and says basically the opposite of what Steve says in The Return of the God Hypothesis. This is a modern case for the idea that God is over, that science has disproven him. And, if you wanted more of these, you could read Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, you could read Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great, but start with Stenger, and that's somebody that, again, high schoolers will be able to read and appreciate, and consider what good points he makes, if any, and why they're wrong, if they are wrong. So that's an important dimension of this. But again, I want to focus here on views that will assert the kind of compatibility of science and faith, because I do think they are compatible. And so I'm going to recommend now James Henham's God's Philosophers, which is about medieval philosophy and the religious motivations of medieval science and philosophy. The medieval era is very difficult to study in its primary text, so very few people do, because it's all this scholastic philosophy and commentaries and answers to questions that nobody thought to ask. And of course, Thomas Aquinas is the great champion of this age, and that gives you a feel for how technical some of it can get. But it's an extraordinarily important period that kind of gets lost after Galileo comes along, and before Galileo, Copernicus, and that whole revolution sort of obscures the fact that it grew out of medieval scholastic philosophy and asking questions about Aristotle's physics. These were the original I'm just asking questions guys. They began in the project of proving that Aristotle was right and the church was right and they could be reconciled and they were right about everything. But in that process, of course, gradually doubts emerged, and by pressing on some of the weak points in Aristotle's philosophy, as Aristotle would have heartily encouraged them to do, by the way, some of these guys, like Duns Scotus, like William of Ockham, like Jean Buridan, there's all Nicolas Orem, there are all sorts of philosophers from this medieval period who lay the groundwork, Buridan and Orem especially, for ideas like momentum, by thinking about Aristotle's theory of motion. And so it's important to realize that that was a religious project and remained a religious project through the era of Copernicus and Galileo and Newton. All those guys, in one way or another, understood themselves to be doing a faithful thing, a religiously observant thing. So God's Philosophers, to reorient yourself about that period and its importance and about the religious motivations of that period. Ed Feser, Aristotle's Revenge. So once you've read about how Aristotle was questioned and in some ways rejected by the scientific revolution, Feser will tell you about how Aristotle actually turns out to be right about most important things. We've focused on these particulate details in which he was wrong, but he would have been totally ready to incorporate those new pieces of information into his larger philosophy, which Feser argues remains valid and useful. And Feser's a wonderful writer, so that's a good book for them to read too. And then finally, I think you should always, as C.S. Lewis says, let the clear sea breeze of the centuries run through your brain. Don't only read modern books. Also read Augustine's Confessions, which contains philosophical reflections on questions that are still very live in relativity, in quantum theory. He's got a whole bunch of stuff about perception and time. And then for extra credit, if you want to go beyond the Confessions is very readable. Get a good translation, read the Loeb or something, or the Penguin edition. Your high schoolers can totally go with you on that. This is really, if you have an extremely precocious high schooler, they may also be interested in the incomplete book on the literal interpretation of Genesis, which is De Genesi ad litteram imperfectus liber, and that I think is only available in Latin. At least I've only ever seen it in Latin or in online English partial translations, but he's got a lot of great stuff in there about how to read Genesis in the light of philosophy and science. So That should be a pretty good curriculum, and I'll leave the links in the description. I would love to hear what you guys think I should add. There's, of course, Michael Polanyi, there's Thomas Kuhn, there's all sorts of guys that I think might be a little bit advanced for high school, for a high school course, but maybe if they go into college, they could read the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, or Kuhn's book on Copernicus, Polanyi's, anything by Polanyi, really. Anyway, there's much more to go, but I think that'll be a good start. As always, I love being here with you. I'm going to drop one other link in the show notes, and that is the conclusion to my series with Jordan Peterson. Or I shouldn't say my series, Jordan Peterson series, in which I showed up, The Foundations of the West. We did one final episode, episode 5, all together in Rome, which just dropped, and I think you guys are really going to love, especially if you're into young heretics. This is a really cool way to go deeper into the history and philosophy of the West. That'll be there. Please, please do rate and subscribe and share and give this show 5 stars and all that good stuff. Check out rejoiceevermore.substack.com. There's going to be a whole bunch of links this time, goodies for you to explore, and I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.